It was a Thursday night in Manchester, New Hampshire, April 26, 1980. A small second-floor apartment, a mother who had stepped out for the evening, and a 14-year-old girl named Laureen Rahn who did not come home. When the mother returned, the door was unlocked. The apartment held small, odd details that didn't make sense. And then, nothing, no trace. Decades later, Laureen's disappearance remains unsolved. It remains unanswered. This is still Unanswered. I'm Erin Calloway. We will spend this hour, the next 30-40 minutes, walking through that night, the days before, what investigators found and what they didn't, and what questions still hang in the file. We'll talk about who Laureen was, how the initial response unfolded, the leads that followed, and what modern tools might still do for a case like this. I want to be clear from the start. There will be no dramatization in this episode, no music underscoring trauma. This is a sober, respectful retelling focused on facts and careful context. My guest is Detective Mark Delaney, retired from the New Hampshire Homicide Division, who has spent decades reviewing unsolved cases from the late 1970s and 80s. Mark, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Erin. I appreciate the invitation. And before we begin, I want to say right up front, these are real people we're talking about. You know that, I know that. So I'll do my best to walk through procedure and possibilities without ever losing that perspective.
Good. Let's start them. Who was Laureen Rahn? She's too often reduced to an age and a date, and I want to put a person back into the middle of this story. From the sources available, Laureen was 14 years old, a teenager living in Manchester with her mother. People who knew her described her as quiet, creative, and, by several accounts, close to a small circle of friends at school. She liked art, she had plans, small teenage plans, nothing that suggested she was about to step away from her life forever. Mark, from an investigative perspective, how important is it to humanize someone before we trace their disappearance?
It's everything, Erin. When you strip a missing person down to a file number, you risk losing context, and the context matters. A 14-year-old has routines, attachments, vulnerabilities that differ from an adult. The way friends, school, family relationships interact can create both opportunities and explanations. When we say Laureen, we must remember she was someone's daughter, someone's friend. That alters the questions we ask.
Right, and the sources indicate that Laureen lived in a modest apartment, a tight living situation with her mother. There were the regular rhythms of school and neighborhood. Nothing in the public record suggests severe family turmoil, although later recollections mention ordinary teenage tensions, arguments, typical friction. Nothing that, on the face of it, would explain a sudden, permanent departure.
Exactly. Ordinary arguments are not the same thing as a planned runaway, but the presence of ordinary friction does push investigators, often unfairly, toward certain early assumptions. In the early 1980s, the tendency was to conclude runaway when a teen was missing unless there was immediately obvious evidence of foul play. That's changed now, thank God, but it affected initial responses in cases like Laureen's.
Let's set the stage for the day before, April 25 into the 26th. Reported accounts indicate Laureen spent time at home, that she had interactions with friends, and that her mother was planning to be out Friday night for some time. There are a few strands of memory from friends and neighbors recorded later. Some say she seemed normal, others recall nothing out of the ordinary. Mark, how do memories like that age over 40 years? How much can we rely on them?
Memory after decades is a tricky thing. People are sincere. They really believe what they remember. But they're also reconstructing events around the facts they know now. time, media, other people's stories seep into memory. So when someone says, "she seemed fine," or "there was tension," you take it as a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. Corroboration matters. Diaries, school records, attendance, eyewitnesses who can be placed at a time and place. Without that, memory is a guide, not a conclusion.
Okay, so the evening of April 26, the night Laureen vanished. The essentials. Laureen was at the apartment. Her mother left for the evening. She returned to find the apartment unlocked and Laureen missing. There are a number of specific details reported from that first discovery that have haunted the case file. Let's walk through those in chronological order. Who was in the apartment with Laureen that night? Sources indicate her younger sibling may have been there, plus a friend or two had been around earlier in the evening. Mark, how common is it for the people closest to the missing person to be the ones who report them missing?
Very common. It's usually a family member who files the initial report because they have daily routines and can quickly identify absences. In the early phase, you want to know who was last with the person, what they were doing, whether there were any arguments, but you also want to protect the scene. That's where the early minutes matter, because if someone moves things around before police get there, you lose trace evidence.
When Laureen's mother returned, the door was unlocked. Inside, several small but unusual things were reported. Items not where they were expected, an impression that something was off, but not violently so. Shoes and clothes. The record shows Laureen's shoes were found in the apartment. Some personal items remained, but she herself was gone. There's inconsistency in some retellings about whether her coat was present or absent, which, on the surface, might sound trivial, but it matters for whether she left voluntarily into the night.
Yeah, people think a coat or no coat is a tiny detail, but it's significant. If a teen walks out voluntarily to the night, you'd expect certain things: shoes, a jacket, a backpack, depending on weather. If things suggest she left without those, that raises different possibilities. But the problem in many old files is those inventories weren't taken with modern forensic thoroughness. Statements were taken, but physical evidence was not always processed with the care we'd prefer today.
So let's be precise where we can. Multiple reports from the time say Laureen's shoes were in the apartment. Personal effects remained. The apartment being unlocked is repeatedly mentioned. There was no immediate sign of forced entry, no immediate signs of a struggle that were publicly reported. Mark, in a disappearance like this, how does the presence or absence of forced entry shape the early classification of the case?
It often pushes investigators toward thinking the person left voluntarily or was taken by someone with access. Forced entry suggests a stranger breaking in, which is a different modus operandi. No forced entry means either the missing person left voluntarily, the person left with someone they voluntarily opened the door for, or the perpetrator used deception, for example, posing as someone who belonged there. And in the 1980s, a lot of those nuances weren't always followed up as aggressively as they would be today.
After the initial discovery, police were notified. Early reports say the case was treated with some initial ambiguity. Nobody immediately concluded foul play. Instead, there were searches, canvasses around the building, interviews with neighbors and friends. Mark, tell listeners what those first 24 to 72 hours typically look like in a missing teenager case from that era.
You'd see neighbors canvassed. People asked if they'd seen anything. Local parks checked. Bus and train terminals queried. Calls made to local hospitals, juvenile shelters. Back then, we didn't have the same instant nationwide databases, but you still did what you could. The priority is to find the last confirmed sighting and to determine if there's any immediate danger. If the initial belief leans toward runaway, resources sometimes get scaled back early, which can be a problem.
And that scaling back, it's something we'll return to. But first, there are a handful of unusual details that have persisted in the case narrative. I want to go through them carefully, one by one, and mark where the documentation is solid and where things slip toward rumor. Reported details include the unlocked door, the presence of Laureen's shoes and certain clothes, some accounts of an electrical or lighting issue inside the apartment, and later reports of unfamiliar people loitering near the building the week of her disappearance. Let's take the lighting point first. Some sources mention lights being on or off in a way that felt inconsistent. Mark, could something like a lighting anomaly signify anything investigative?
Lighting issues can be red herrings. Often they're just what people notice and later assign meaning to. But they can also be important. For example, a light left on could mean someone left in a hurry. Or if a bulb was changed, it could mean someone else had been inside. The problem in many of these cases is that by the time someone documents it, the physical context has shifted. So we flag it, we look for corroboration, and if nothing else supports it, we note it as a detail that's interesting but not conclusive.
Another thread that recurs in public discussion is reports of people, unfamiliar to neighbors, seen near the building around that time. Some of these sightings were never officially corroborated. Others were followed up to varying degrees. Mark, how do investigators weigh neighborhood sightings like that? There are dozens of people who could plausibly be unfamiliar in any urban area.
You weigh them based on specificity and corroboration. Someone saying, "I saw a guy I'd never seen," is less useful than, "I saw a man in a blue jacket at 10:30 who spoke to a teenage girl on the corner." Time, description, and direction of travel matter. You also try to cross-check. Were there cars registered to anyone connected? Surveillance footage? Well, in 1980, a lot of that didn't exist. But even license plate sightings from a neighbor can be helpful. The challenge in Laureen's case, as in many old cases, is that those follow-ups sometimes weren't documented in a way we can rely on now.
Which brings us to an important point: documentation, record-keeping, and early investigative decisions. From the surviving materials, it seems the case may have been influenced by early assumptions and by the investigative resources available at the time. Mark, can you walk us through some specific decisions that, if handled differently, might have changed the case's trajectory?
There are a few recurrent problems in older cases. One is delayed forensic processing, evidence not collected or logged. Two is classification as runaway, which can deprioritize the case. Three is limited canvas and witness re-interviewing as memories fade. For example, if there was a footprint in a stairwell and no cast was taken, that's a lost opportunity. If someone reported a suspicious call and that call wasn't recorded or traced, well, phones were different back then, but any missed chance to preserve a lead is crucial. In fairness to investigators at the time, they were working without today's DNA tools, without nationwide Amber Alert systems. Still, we can identify moments where a different choice could have preserved more evidence.
Let's talk about phone calls and possible sightings after the initial disappearance. There are accounts that Laureen's family received calls that felt linked to the case, and there were scattered reports of girls matching Laureen's description seen in neighboring towns. Some of those tips were investigated. Many were not robust enough to lead anywhere. Mark, in cold cases, how often do tips years later prove pivotal?
More often than you might think. People move, relationships shift, hidden connections sometimes surface decades later. I've seen cold case tips come from someone who finally decided to talk, or from an image resurfacing online that jogged a memory. But the key is careful validation. You don't want to be led down path after path without corroboration. A credible tip will have a detail that could only be known by someone involved or extremely close to the events.
So let's examine the main theories that people, investigators, and armchair sleuths have proposed in Laureen's case. Broadly, 3 emerge: voluntary runaway, abduction by someone she knew, or abduction by a stranger or opportunistic offender. For each, we should lay out supporting points and weaknesses. Start with the runaway theory. What supports it and what undermines it?
Support for a runaway theory usually comes from things like personal items left behind, a history of running, or notes indicating intent. In Laureen's case, the presence of shoes and some personal items is sometimes cited as consistent with a voluntary departure. But that could mean she left with little, or it could mean she was taken without the chance to gather her things. The lack of prior runaway history and the fact that friends described her as having normal plans weigh against it. So the runaway theory cannot be ruled out solely on those grounds, but it lacks compelling supporting evidence.
Next theory: someone she knew. This includes acquaintances, family friends, or people in the neighborhood. What evidence points toward that possibility?
The door being unlocked, the lack of forced entry, and the demographics of teenage abductions sometimes suggest familiarity. If someone she knew had been expected later that night or had the ability to approach her without causing alarm, that's consistent with someone she knew. However, absence of clear motives or corroborated sightings of those interactions limits our ability to push the file in that direction without more proof.
And the stranger or opportunistic abduction theory, what supports that?
That's supported by neighborhood sightings of unfamiliar people and the fact that many abductions are opportunistic. But again, in this particular case, there were no credible, corroborated sightings of a stranger forcibly taking a girl. It's a plausible scenario, statistically plausible, but the file lacks the kind of witness statements or physical evidence to elevate it above other possibilities.
Throughout the decades, there have been occasional leads tying this case to other crimes or suspects in the region. Some were investigated and ruled out, others faded. Mark, how do investigators decide when to link cold cases together and when to treat them separately?
You look for signature behaviors, unique MO elements, geographic and temporal connections, and forensic links. A suspect who targets the same demographic, who uses similar methods, or whose vehicle is tied to multiple events becomes interesting. But we avoid connecting cases just because they're similar in age or location. In Laureen's case, there were a few peripheral leads that warranted checking, people who later were identified in unrelated crimes, but none produced the sort of corroborated tie we'd need to move charges forward.
Let's pause and reflect on the family perspective. Over the years, Laureen's mother publicly sought answers and continued to hope for resolution. The community in Manchester remembers the disappearance with a kind of persistent unease. Mark, from an investigative and human point of view, what does the passage of time do to families and to community memory?
It's devastating. The uncertainty eats its survivors. Investigatively, time erodes physical evidence and blurs memories, but it can also produce new opportunities. People change allegiances, grudges soften, confessions sometimes happen late. From a human perspective, the family lives with the not knowing every day. That's a burden investigators try to keep in mind. It's not just a case, it's a life on pause.
I want listeners to hear that. It's important to remember that. It's important to remember that this is about a person who vanished from the world of the living without public explanation. The emotional toll is ongoing. Now, practical question. Where does the investigation stand today? Public records suggest the case is still open with local authorities. Mark, If a listener had a small piece of information, even something they'd dismiss as trivial, what should they do? Who do they contact, and how are such tips handled?
Anyone with information should contact the Manchester, New Hampshire Police Department and ask to speak to the Detective Division or to the Cold Case Unit if one is assigned. If they don't want to call, they can use an anonymous tip service. Many police departments list anonymous tip lines or online forms on their websites. If the information is immediate and possibly life-threatening, call 911. Everything gets logged, and detectives will assess credibility and attempt to corroborate. Even a small detail can be the missing link, so please don't assume it's not worth reporting.
I want to be careful here. I don't want to invent contact numbers on air. For accuracy, please go to the Manchester Police Department website or contact your local police and they can route the information. If you prefer anonymity, use the department's online reporting or any local Crime Stoppers program. Mark, what modern forensic possibilities could be applied to a case like Laureen's, assuming there is physical evidence that was preserved?
If evidence was preserved, clothing, hair, a cigarette butt, anything that might contain biological material, it could be re-examined with modern DNA techniques. We can now run degraded samples, enter profiles into national databases, and sometimes get distant familial matches. There's also the possibility of re-examining witness statements in light of new timelines or comparing details to other cases via shared databases. Age progression images can help with sighting reports, though they're more useful when there's reason to believe a person is living. The bottom line is, modern tools have solved cold cases that were stuck for decades, but they require preserved evidence and careful casework.
Were there specific evidentiary items documented in Laureen's original file that we know survived into later custody? Any preserved items that might be tested today?
From what I've seen in public records, there's ambiguity. Some evidence appears to have been logged, but the chain of custody, condition, and preservation are less clear than we'd like. That's a common problem with older files, indicators that something was collected, but not enough clarity on how it was stored. That said, many departments are now recataloguing old evidence precisely to find those items for retesting.
Let's address one of the ethical considerations head-on. True crime coverage can veer into sensationalism very easily, naming uncharged individuals, amplifying rumors. We've intentionally avoided that. Mark, from your perspective, what are the dangers when cases like Laureen's are dramatized or aggressively speculated about in public forums?
The harms are real. You can plant false memories, you can mislead witnesses, you can harm families by repeating unverified accusations. Worse, you can push real leads into noise, making it harder for detectives to sort signal from static. Responsible coverage helps keep attention on the case and may elicit tips. Irresponsible coverage can do damage. So it's good you're taking a careful approach, Erin.
Thank you. That responsibility guides our editorial choices in talking about this case tonight. I also want to ask about the role of public attention over the years. Podcasts, renewed media interest, they can be a double-edged sword. Mark, when new attention arrives, how do investigators integrate incoming information and manage the influx of tips, some of which may be the product of misinformation?
You triage. You log everything. You prioritize tips with verifiable elements, times, places, names, and you assign investigators to follow up while keeping families informed. You also work to dispel rumors by clarifying what is and isn't true publicly, when possible. The key is to turn public energy into productive leads, not into a forum for speculation.
We've talked about theories, but we haven't yet named any individuals. I'm not going to do that. The public record includes names in some contexts, But, as we said earlier, we avoid repeating uncharged allegations. Instead, let's recap what remains unanswered in concrete terms. What happened in the hours between the mother leaving and her return? Who, precisely, was the last person to see Laureen? Were there any undisclosed witnesses? Are there physical artifacts preserved that could yield DNA? Mark, is that a fair list?
That's a clear, fair list. Add to it. Was any anonymous or suspicious phone contact ever traced? Were neighborhood canvasses fully documented? And have all persons of interest, including individuals who later developed violent histories, been thoroughly vetted against this file? Those are the kinds of questions that keep a cold case alive.
We've spoken with care tonight about how little we can say for certain and about where the file is thin. I want to give listeners a sense of what a plausible next step looks like. Mark, if authorities were to reopen or reprioritize Laureen's case today, what would be the initial steps in a modern cold case review?
First, an administrative review. Gather all original reports, statements, physical evidence, and forensic logs. Second, create a timeline from the last confirmed sighting to the first unambiguous discovery. Third, re-interview key witnesses with modern cognitive interviewing techniques, because you can often elicit details years later that weren't accessible before. Fourth, inventory and retest any physical evidence using current DNA methods. Fifth, cross-check the file against other crimes and individuals in national databases. If family members are still involved, you keep them informed and involve them where appropriate.
And practically speaking, how often do cold case reviews like that produce new leads?
The rate of new actionable leads isn't sky high, but it's significant enough that it's worth doing. Advances in DNA in particular have transformed cold case outcomes. I can point to multiple homicides and disappearances from the 70s and 80s that were solved decades later with genetic genealogy or improved testing. So while it's not guaranteed, it's an essential step.
Before we close, I want to read, slowly and with respect, a short summary of the key, confirmed facts in this case as they stand in the record, so listeners are left with the clearest possible picture. Mark, if anything I say drifts from what's verified, interrupt me. I want to be precise.
I will.
Laureen Rahn was 14 years old at the time of her disappearance. The date was April 26, 1980. She lived in Manchester, New Hampshire, in a small apartment with her mother. Her mother left the apartment that evening. When the mother returned, the apartment was unlocked and Laureen was missing. Personal items, including shoes, remained in the apartment. There was no publicly documented evidence of forced entry or a struggle. The case was investigated by local authorities. Over the years, it has received periodic attention but remains unsolved. The family has sought answers for decades. The case remains open, and authorities continue to welcome information. Mark, is that an accurate summary?
Yes, that's a careful, accurate recitation of the core facts as they're publicly known. It avoids conjecture and leaves room for investigators to fill in gaps with verified evidence.
Thank you. I want to end with an appeal. If you have information, no matter how small it seems, please report it. Contact the Manchester Police Department or your local law enforcement and ask them to forward information to the detective assigned to cold cases or missing persons. If you prefer to remain anonymous, use an anonymous tip service. If you think you might have a memory you've never shared, write it down. Sometimes the act of writing clarifies details you didn't realize you remembered. And if you are a family member or someone affected by this case who wants to speak to us, reach out through the podcast email. We will treat you with respect and care. Laureen Rahn was 14 when she disappeared. Her case remains unanswered.
I'll just add, for anybody who's listening and who wants to help in a practical way, be as specific as you can when you call. Dates, times, locations, descriptions, vehicle information, names. Those specifics are what detectives need. Don't be discouraged if you think the detail is too small. Often, it isn't.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you to everyone who listened with care. This was not done to satisfy curiosity. It was done to keep attention on a human life that deserves answers. We'll keep checking in on cases like this, respectfully, precisely, and without sensationalism. If you value this approach, please tell others who might have information. For now, I'm Erin Calloway. Mark Delaney, thank you for sharing your time and experience.
Thank you, Erin. Take care.
This has been Still Unanswered. If you have information about the disappearance of Laureen Rahn, please contact the Manchester NH Police Department. For non-emergency tips, consult the department's official website for the appropriate contact or anonymous reporting options. If someone is in immediate danger, dial 911. Laureen's name and age again. Laureen Rahn, 14 years old, vanished April 26, 1980. She is not forgotten. Good night.